a major policy addressing carbon pollution state by state in the U.S. Despite the recent Supreme Court stay, many states continue developing their individual state implementation plans, and the need for information and clarity regarding this policy remains. So our webinar series continues to explore the role of renewables, especially bioenergy, in the state-level plans being designed right now. The goal of this webinar series is to take stock of what we know, what opportunities this policy opens nationally and locally, what information from recent literature should enter this topic of conversation, how we can conduct fair and balanced advocacy on behalf of the industry in which we study and work, and what uncertainties stakeholders in the bioeconomy face when engaging on this topic. As I said, today's presentation is the fifth in this webinar series. Our first presentation gave an overview of the context for American carbon policy and biomass in the Clean Power Plan, and our second and third focused on carbon accounting in general and through a specific framework. Last month, we looked at the intersection of the CPP with traditional forest product markets and the need to carefully evaluate all of those present on the webpage previewing, along with longer series schedule detailing future presentations in the series. That webpage URL can also be found linked in the chat pod on the left or in the notes for the recording. Our next presentation introduces some examples of state-level approaches into the CPP, with speakers Marcus Kaufman of the Oregon Department of Forestry and Chuck Hersey with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources on May 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Again, all webinar sessions will be recorded and released on YouTube to allow for later viewing and sharing via that series webpage I mentioned. During today's presentation, you can feel free to type your questions into the chat pod, and we'll set aside some time at the end to go through them with our speaker. The presentation today, entitled What the Biomass Power Industry Can Expect, by Carrie Annand, who has more than a decade of public affairs experience in Washington, D.C. Her diverse communications background includes political communications, experience serving on the staff of one of the most influential congressional committees, and international expertise honed from years spent working for foreign governments. Carrie has worked with the Biomass Power Association for nearly 6 years, expanding her role as a communications consultant to become Vice President for External Affairs. She oversees communications, government relations, and membership outreach for the association. She also leads National Bioenergy Day, which you probably know, an annual national advocacy day for bioenergy happening each October. Now in its fourth year and supported by the U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Department of Energy, more than 100 corporations, universities, and state government agencies across the country have participated in events recognizing bioenergy. We're so pleased that Carrie brings this considerable experience to the great benefit of our webinar series in today's presentation. Carrie, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about the EPA and biomass. This has been a very active topic over the last few weeks, so we certainly have a lot to talk about today. And let's see, I hope everyone can hear me. If they heard Sarah, they probably... If you can't hear me, please do type in and let me know. Thanks, Sarah. I see your chat. That sounds good. Okay, so I will just start with an introduction of the Biomass Power Association. I'm sure several of you are familiar with us. We represent the biomass to electricity sector all over the country. That's just the United States. We've got about 40 members in places where there is biomass where you'd expect. So that includes California, New England, up Pacific Northwest, Upper Midwest, and a few in the Southeast. We have seen some growth in biomass over the past few years in the Southeast. And in the United States, I'm seeing that I might be too close. Is this better? I'll sit back from my computer a little bit. Hopefully that sounds better to you. Thanks for that note. Good. Okay, so, and it's important to note, I'm sure as all of you are aware, the biomass industry in the United States is focused on residues from as well railroad ties, and that sort of thing. As of yet, in the United States, we don't use pelletized fuel. The market simply doesn't support that. So we're talking about just waste that is purchased by facilities and used in a boiler. In the U.S., the biggest facility is about 100 megawatts. Actually, there are two facilities, only one of which is in operation, Gainesville, Florida, which is 100 megawatts. The rest of them are fairly small, 20 to 40 megawatts, and serve a fairly small area, purchasing fuel from the 50 to 75 mile radius. And I say that because I want to contrast the U.S. biomass industry again with, with what you see overseas and the U.K., where you've seen major coal facilities just completely converted to biomass. And so what we're talking about here in the United States is a much smaller. Only Canada has started to convert some big coal facilities to biomass too, and they're using pelletized fuel. So we're keeping a close eye on that as well. So here's just a map of what biomass looks like in the United States. California, that's where biomass started in the United States, and that's where it continues to the state of California has the most biomass facilities. Although, as we'll talk about a little bit later, a lot of the facilities in California, as well as in New England, are having some trouble now with the market and policies that need reconsideration. So to jump into talking about the EPA, I thought it would be helpful to talk about, or just to remind everyone of what the EPA's mission statement is. And I'll just read it for you. It's right here, but I'll read it. The EPA's basic mission is to protect human health and the environment, and that includes air, water, and land. EPA, state, local, and tribal agencies work together to ensure compliance with environmental laws passed by Congress, state legislatures, and tribal governments. And before we get into the EPA's treatment of biomass, I do want to emphasize to you that the EPA is often in a kind of a tough spot because they have, on the one hand, they have people like us in the industry telling them what we need to grow and what we need to be able to fully utilize our technologies. And then on the other hand, they have environmental groups that that kind of serve as sort of serve as brakes on their policies. Are very active in weighing in on what the EPA is doing, not only in the media but also by challenging the EPA's regulations in court. And so then you also have the Supreme Court weighing in, and as we'll see, it's sometimes stopping what the EPA is doing or putting a hold on it. So, the EPA does have these competing constituencies that they are often trying to listen to and reflect in their regulations. So to start off with the EPA's history with biomass, we'll go back to May 2010, and that's when the EPA first started to regulate carbon from stationary sources with the tailoring rule. And so the EPA introduced this tailoring rule that was meant to apply to all sources of carbon emissions, and that's everything from coal to to anything that emits carbon. So that fuels as well as biogenic fuels. Of course, the industry had something to say about that and objected to the kind of lumping together of biogenic emissions and geologic emissions together. So the EPA listened to industry and about a year later passed the deferral rule, which acknowledged that the EPA didn't didn't have a well-developed study on biogenic emissions. And so they said, let's take 3 years and study carbon from biogenic sources, during which time these biogenic sources, standalone biomass facilities, are exempt from the tailoring rule. And during this 3 years, we're going to study the issue. We're going to put together the Scientific Advisory Board panel to weigh in on this. And at the end of the 3 years, hopefully we'll have a better sense of how we want to count carbon from biogenic fuels. And the SAB panel, they put out a biogenic framework that was to help the EPA account for carbon from biogenic sources, and they continue to kind of weigh it, how they're going to go with this legislation until June, or not legislation but regulation, until June 2014, when the Supreme Court kind of stopped the EPA in their tracks by invalidating the tailoring rule and the deferral rule in one fell swoop. And so, luckily, I suppose the EPA was banking on this, or had anticipated this could happen, because just about in the same month, after the same time that the tailoring rule was was invalidated, the EPA introduced the Clean Power Plan, which, as we all know, is its attempt to kind of look at carbon from all industry. And so it released the first iteration of the Clean Power Plan, and it made it very clear that the goal was major reductions in emissions from fossil fuel power. So again and again in the rule, you hear affected EGUs. That term is used to refer to fossil fuel emissions, and the EPA set up carbon targets for every single state to meet these. The EPA said, all right, the state of Maine, your current carbon level is X, and expect it to be much lower at a different level, or by lower its carbon output by a certain percentage. Plans that they would have to run by the EPA to meet the targets set by the EPA. At this time, the role of biomass was very unclear. The EPA hadn't put out any sort of guidance. The EPA had, in the Clean Power Plan, mentioned a potential role for biomass, but hadn't really defined how biomass could take part in the Clean Power Plan. And because of the history with the tailoring rule and deferral rule, and because of the ongoing Scientific Advisory Board discussions and deliberations, I think there was a lot of kind of, I don't want to say anxiety, but a lot of kind of a lot of questions in the industry about how the Clean Power Plan would ultimately treat biomass. And then, skip ahead, so the Clean Power Plan was introduced in June. In November of that year, we had the McCabe Memorandum from the EPA. And this was a very welcome turn of events for the industry. We were very pleased to see that memorandum, so named for Janet McCabe. She's still is the acting assistant administrator of the Office of Air and Radiation. So this is a big deal that this guidance comes out from her office, and basically says that waste-derived biomass and forest-derived biomass is going to be treated as carbon neutral and under the Clean Power Plan. And with the memorandum that was released, there was like a 75-page document on how to account for sustainably sourced biomass. So, you know, it said on the one hand that waste-derived and forest-derived biomass is considered carbon neutral. On the other hand, it sort of opened up a whole new can of worms as to how the EPA was going to how the EPA was going to consider sustainability and forest sustainability. So that did pose some questions by the industry. However, all in all, this was taken as a really positive sign that the EPA envisioned a role for biomass in the Clean Power Plan, and that, you know, as the plan moved forward, that that biomass, you know, could be seen by states as a compliance mechanism. But yeah, however, at the end here, the term waste-derived, you know, there were still questions about waste-derived and whether that would include any, you know, and I'll just read it, that is a byproduct of a non-energy related activity. So go on to the next slide. And so this is the Biomass Power Association. We've created this illustration to show, you know, this is a communications challenge that we have, is how do we talk about the types of materials that are being used for biomass. And you know, a lot of the kind of environmental community and anti-biomass organizations like to imply that biomass industry is cutting down trees for electricity, for energy. That's just really not economically possible here in the United States. We don't have the subsidies that, you know, that would support something like that. And, you know, as we see here, we needed to show this is what we're using for biomass. And the blue parts of the diagram here are the types of materials that are used for biomass. And as you see, you only get those materials when there is another market that's actually driving the harvesting of trees. And the green part of the tree here, mill, a sawmill, and the more brown parts would probably go to a pulp and paper mill. But if you don't have those other markets, you're not getting biomass. So this was kind of not our response to the McKay Memorandum, but it was sort of like our way of illustrating that this is what we are, in fact, the way that biomass is being practiced in the United States should, by and large, entirely be included in the Clean Power Plan. So then this past August, the final Clean Power Plan came out. Again, I know that if you've been listening to webinars, you probably have a good sense of this, but I will just I'll just do a kind of a refresher. The affected EGU remains the primary target of the Clean Power Plan. You know, the EPA, the purpose of the Clean Power Plan, as far as I'm concerned, is to reduce carbon emissions from fossil fuel sources. And so as a state is looking at its sort of power assets, then, you know, the coal facilities are really going to be required to have much lower emissions. And as far as how biomass fits into that, the Clean Power Plan did pull back from the McKay Memorandum a little bit. So now the Clean Power Plan, the final iteration of it, set up sort of carbon markets where a state could decide that they're going to be a rate-based state or a mass-based state, and then what's called the qualified facilities in that state could participate in that. I mean, it's probably not completely accurate to call it a carbon market, but that's sort of what it is. That means that the qualified facilities can trade among themselves and either get credits for what they're doing, or if you're not a qualified facility, you could buy a credit. And that's just a really simplified version of it. The mass-based version is similar, although it's buying, instead of credits, it's allowances for emissions. So, and a state is required to put together a plan, either one way or the other. The catch here, for not only for biomass but for other qualified facilities, is that the only facilities that can qualify have to have come online. Now, if you work in the biomass industry, you know that a very significant portion of the biomass assets in the United States came online well before January 1st, 2013. So the majority of the biomass facilities in the country won't be allowed to fully participate in the final plan, or in their state's implementation plans. However, if the target is going to be fossil fuel, if the real purpose of the plan is to reduce carbon from fossil fuel facilities, what I expect will happen is that states who are in need of good, reliable baseload power are going to be looking to biomass to kind of fill the gap. And again, this is my own speculation. It's really not, I think that there are still a lot of questions that remain about the final, how the plan's going to move forward, which I'll get to in a minute. But to me, I think that, looking at how states are going to develop their plans, I see that biomass could play a big role. And when I mentioned a couple minutes ago that the final plan walked back the McCabe Memorandum a little bit, and to some extent, the final plan really, so the can write its own state implementation plan, and if it doesn't, then there's a federal implementation plan, sort of a template, carbon reduction model that the EPA has developed that will then go into effect for a state that does not submit a plan. And it's just kind of like, plugging in elements of the energy, of what could possibly be happening in the state. And, the EPA has designed it so that this goes into effect for a state that doesn't submit a plan. Now, the federal plan that they put forward, it does not mention biomass at all. On the other hand, it also left questions, it left open the question of potentially including biomass because it was open for comments, unlike the rest of the Clean Power Plan, which was, the EPA made very clear was final and not going to change. So, we have, of course, weighed in to say that biomass should be included in the federal model plan. What if, just for a second to speculate, what if, for instance, a state that, I would expect Minnesota to submit a state implementation plan, but if it didn't, and the federal model plan went into place, and biomass isn't included in that, then that would be pretty unfortunate for biomass. So we certainly hope that does include biomass. Also, the EPA mentioned in the final Clean Power Plan that they weren't really sure what sorts of feedstock should qualify. How should they treat forest sustainability? They also introduced this concept of evaluation, monitoring, and verification requirements. They left open the question of co-firing, which I expect will will come into play at some point. So EM&V requirements. A lot of biomass facilities already are either part of the SFI program or the FSC program. States already have their own forest sustainability practices in place. Is the EPA going to say that the Clean Power Plan sustainability practices are going to supersede what the states already have in place? We certainly would not want to see that happen. We think that each state already has its own forestry guidelines, and that the EPA should defer to those. In part because there really isn't a one-size-fits-all model that could apply to all the states in terms of forest sustainability. And Oregon is going to be very different to the way that it's practiced in New Hampshire. And partly you have different species, and you have different market, and it's just the idea that there's one model is kind of hard for us to picture how that would work. And we also don't want to see the EPA get too bogged down in what types of feedstocks. In our view, as we talked about before, if it is a residue from a non-forest or non-energy related activity, then it should be included as a feedstock. It should be allowed. It's a waste, and it should be able to be used to create electricity. There's wide scientific consensus on the carbon benefits of using residues for power. So these are the questions that that really are unclear. And biomass co-firing, I'll mention that too. As the state is looking at how to reduce emissions from coal, and utilities are looking at the same thing. Are they going to look at the use of pellets, co-firing with pellets? I don't know, but I certainly think that there's a strong. So anyway, this is just to give an overview of how biomass fit into the final Clean Power Plan. Renewable baseload is of course going to be extremely important. When I really do benefit the most from the plan, and the EPA wants to encourage from the Clean Power Plan wants to encourage new investment and opening new facilities and new energy generation. But if the bulk of those benefits are going to wind and solar, that's an awful lot of intermittent electricity that could be going online. My reading is that the renewable baseloads that we already have in place and are going to have to play a big role in order to support the benefits that wind and solar are going to get, and the potential growth. And I see a question: wind and solar benefits such as wind and solar. Well, first of all, there's a lot more new wind and solar out there than there is biomass. A much larger proportion of wind and solar went online after January 1st, 2013 than biomass. So there's, therefore the proportion of wind and solar projects that are going to be able to qualify for the market to receive credits or to participate in the sort of state carbon markets that are going to be created are going to be the proportion of those projects for wind and solar are going to be much higher than the biomass, or hydro or any sort of renewable baseload that, we've been around a while, so we're not going to be able to qualify. So just that in itself will be part of it. There are also a couple of other sort of, little benefits, or I don't want to say little, like minimizing them, but they're a little bit more specific for wind and solar. For instance, if a wind or solar project is built in a low-income community, that project, I believe, is able to qualify for twice the credits, and that doesn't work for the other renewable baseloads, for biomass or a couple of the other ones. So just to give you an idea, I mean, the Clean Power Plan really is geared towards, in many cases, the new investments, the new energy generation, and wind and solar do benefit quite a bit. A couple of months ago, when we had two major events happen within a week of each other that will both have could have a large impact on the Clean Power Plan. The first was that the Supreme Court decided to put a the legal challenges are being decided in court. So that happened in the second week of February, and then just about 4 or 5 days later, Justice Scalia passed away. So both of these events together, it's having the Clean Power Plan put on hold. As we talked about before, the state implementation plans are due in September of this year. So the fact that the entire plan is put on hold 6 months before, and you do have a lot of states that are pretty steadfastly refusing to take part in it. So this was not a great development for the Clean Power Plan, for the EPA, to have it put on hold. But then Justice Scalia passes away, and so now you have a split court. And if the U.S. District Court in D.C. Decides in favor of the Clean Power Plan, which is it's expected to, then the case goes to the Supreme Court. If there's not a new justice by then, and you have a split decision 4-4, then the lower court decision stands. So now there is a possibility that the plan could move forward, but is that likely to happen before next year? Probably not. And by next year, you have a new president. So I just wanted to kind of remind everyone that the Clean Power Plan, until earlier this year, was really on track to kind of remake the energy kind of, I don't want to say portfolio because it has other connotations, but it was really going to change the energy market in the U.S. And now there are a lot of questions about what's going to happen with it. So I wanted to go back to when I first mentioned we first started talking about the EPA's treatment of biomass. You'll remember that the EPA set up the Scientific Advisory Board panel sort of as a response to this question of how should we delineate, how do we account, is it different than geologic carbon? So the EPA set up this Scientific Advisory Board panel in 2011, and the panel still exists today. Its mission to figure out how to account for biogenic carbon is still continuing. And originally they had set out 3 years for their. We are now under the 5th year, so it's really proven to be a much more complicated process, I think, than they envisioned. I'm just guessing, just from watching the proceedings. When they originally started deliberating, I think it was really a kind of an open-ended question, like how do you account for any sort of biogenic carbon emissions, and just completely separately, completely divorced from any sort of policy. How do you is there some sort of an equation that we can do? Is there a life cycle analysis? How do you do that? And I think that as they've gone forward, they're grappling with forest sustainability. They're grappling with the Clean Power Plan, and how will their decisions influence the Clean Power Plan, and how the EPA treats biomass under the plan. So I think that the circumstances around the panel have changed a lot in the 5 years that they've been convened. And I also think that that with the introduction of the Clean Power Plan, they have had that now that there is the Clean Power Plan, should we tailor what we're doing to that plan, because that's going to be the prevailing regulatory framework that governs biogenic emissions, and they've generally decided that that's not what the mission is. So they're continuing on this kind of open-ended question path. And most recently they met just a few weeks ago, March 31st to April 1st of 2016, and they reviewed a framework that they had come up with, and they were deciding whether to submit it to the EPA, whether to say, we're done with this. This is the best that we can do. We're going to give it to the EPA, and they decided that they still had more to talk about. There was a lot of discussion among the panelists on how to account for forest sustainability. And interestingly, I thought that the chair, Dr. Madhu Khanna from Illinois, she reminded everyone, that it's just based on economic, just on the economic factors that that biomass is based on. She said that she is confident that biomass emissions are 60 to 70% better than coal, and that the panel's charge is to evaluate emissions, not to preserve the forest. So there really is just a lot of uncertainty as to how the SAB panel is going to move forward. There are so many diverging opinions on the panel itself that anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's. There's also a timing question here. The SAB panel is still convened. The Clean Power Plan has mentioned the SAB proceedings. Is now, especially with the stay in the Clean Power Plan, will the SAB have a framework available to include in the Clean Power Plan and the federal model? I don't know. It's 5 years and counting now, so again, just a lot of uncertainty. And then just 2 weeks ago, so just a few days after the SAB panel meeting, the EPA held a biomass workshop. Now the EPA announced this workshop as sort of a stakeholder process. How are we going to treat the biomass under the Clean Power Plan? Just kind of back up onto our initial reaction when they announced the workshop. We were encouraged about it. We encouraged the EPA to consider having an actual biomass facility, especially a qualified facility, one that came online after January 1st, 2013, to have someone from one of those facilities present at the workshop to talk about how the plan could potentially affect their business. And they actually did not invite anyone from the industry, from the biomass to electricity industry to participate. So at first we were a little discouraged by that, However, the Biomass Workshop overall was from an industry perspective, we were very encouraged by what we heard and saw that day. The economists present testifying were basically universally saying, as long as forest stocks are increasing, which their models indicate that they are, and as long as biomass isn't being used as a market driver, the market does not support that. If these two factors are in place, forests are increasing and biomass is not, we're not cutting down trees for biomass, which doesn't make sense. Then it is a carbon beneficial technology. We heard this over and over from economists, from scientists, and also, very importantly, from the state policy experts who included forestry and energy. These experts agreed on this was very encouraging. The states that were represented were Minnesota, New Hampshire, California, Oregon, and South Carolina. All states with strong biomass, and several of them noted that biomass is having a tough time from a market perspective. Natural gas prices are really low. And they pointed to the important role that biomass plays in their states in keeping their forests healthy and just in providing baseload power. So I noted in the beginning that Sarah said that that Marcus Kaufman from the state of Oregon will be doing a webinar soon, and I would definitely encourage you to tune into that. I certainly will be, because he testified at the Biomass Workshop, and he was very very clear that he sees a role for biomass, and even asked that day. Most of the biomass facilities, as we mentioned before, won't be able to under the plan. Do you see a role for these older facilities and in the plan and in your state plans? And Marcus Kaufman, recognize that this is something that they're looking at and thinking about. So as much as it isn't clear how that is going to take place, I think it's something that we're going to see. I think states are going to be really thinking about it. If you have a perfectly good biomass facility that is providing 24/7 baseload power and contributing to the market, how are we going to make sure that it is playing a role in our state implementation plan and our state's energy policy? And last but not least, I'm just going to talk a little bit about congressional and state policy, and then I'll open up for questions. Today, actually, the Senate Energy Bill is being considered by the Senate. As right before we started this webinar, the Senate concluded its vote on the FAA bill and was this bill includes an amendment that would declare energy from biomass carbon neutral, as long as forest stocks are increasing. So this is something that we were very pleased to see included in the Senate Energy Bill. If the Energy Bill passes today, which it is expected to, that means that there will be a conference with the House Energy Bill, which does not have this biomass carbon neutrality amendment included. So whether this amendment survives through to the President's desk is not clear. An amendment to a major energy bill was very encouraging to us. It was championed by the two main senators, Collins and King, Senator Susan Collins, Senator Angus King, and several other senators, Senator Wyden, Senator Ayotte, the list of senators you see on the third bullet. These are our champions: Collins and King from Maine, Klobuchar, Franken from Minnesota, Senator Wyden from Oregon, who's also introduced a bioenergy funding, sort of an R&D bill, and then Shaheen and Ayotte from New Hampshire. So these are big biomass states, and we're getting a lot of really good support from these senators. The House also has its Biomass Caucus, which is about 20 to 25 members, also members with biomass in their districts. It's headed by Ann Custer from New Hampshire and Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, a Democrat and a Republican, and they've been really active in making sure that they're talking about EPA and talking about biomass policy. So we're very grateful to that. And then we action on the state levels. Maine, just on Friday, the Maine legislature agreed to support the biomass industry, which is having a tough time in this state, with paper mills closing and with really low natural gas prices. So we're hoping that that bills like that will kind of help keep the biomass industry strong until the Clean Power Plan kicks in and provides an extra little help to the industry and support for us. As we've been talking about, there still is a ton of uncertainty. We don't know what the SAB panel is going to do, what their timeline is. Congressional action is a question. The Clean Power Plan is currently on hold. Who knows when that's going to happen? There's an election happening, as we all know, which could have a very big impact on how not just biomass, but the entire energy economy changes. And then market shifts, the natural gas, the fossil fuel prices going up and down. So there's a lot of questions, but all in all, in the past few weeks especially, we've seen a lot of very encouraging indications that, that there's support for biomass, there's support for the science behind biomass, and its role is in helping the environment and supporting forest economies. And so we're encouraged by all this. So now if people have questions, feel free to weigh in.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We have plenty of time for questions, so go ahead and type them into the chat pod on the left. Something I've really loved about hosting this series so far is that, yes, each of our speakers come. They also provided such a wonderful chronology of this ever-changing policy landscape over the last few months. It seems like every month there is some new update or major change taking place, and we've been able to kind of sort of take stock of that as we go along in this webinar series and log it in those dated recordings that we have available. So that alone, I think, has been so valuable as biomass stakeholders wrestle with how to engage on the Clean Power Plan. I'm so glad that Carrie has continued that in her comments today. Maybe I'll just pick up with a couple of those things that you've sort of, that are a little time sensitive. So you mentioned the Collins Amendment that's being discussed today. So am I correct in the assumption that the biopower industry probably really wants to see the Collins Amendment pass to simplify biomass carbon accounting as essentially carbon neutral across the board? Do you see this as a single case that's necessary to ease biomass incorporation into the Clean Power Plan, or as something broader that's necessary for not just the Clean Power Plan, but future bioenergy legislation as kind of a lasting precedent?
I think that's a really good question. One thing that we don't want to see happen is biomass becoming, an issue of the right or an issue of the left. It should be something that has wide support. Wanted to be careful about was to make sure that it wasn't, Senate, something that Senate supports, or Republicans or Democrats or the president. It's something that we can find broad support on. And so the amendment to the energy bill was a bit of a surprise to us, but a welcome surprise. It was bipartisan, supported by a really good bipartisan group of senators that are from biomass states. And with the kind of last minute inclusion of the line that, as long as forest stocks are stable or increasing, we know that biomass is not driving deforestation, that biomass in and of itself, doesn't really exist without forestry and paper and the rest of the forest products industry. So that's not something that we're concerned about, but we also know that it's important to lay that out. So I think the way that we saw the amendment take shape and the way that we saw it, it was very encouraging to us, and we hope that it does continue in the energy bill and see what happens. Hopefully the president would sign off on it.
Okay, thanks. We talked a lot about that kind of question, how should carbon accounting happen with biomass energy? And each of our speakers has kind of come at that from a different angle. We've talked about how practical implementation is easier with something that's sweeping across the board like the Collins Amendment, but you might lose something there in translation. So some of our previous speakers have also leaned toward an approved feedstock list state by state for clean power plant implementation. Do you see that favorably as well, as maybe a less uniform way to get things going? Do you see that direction benefiting a more complex approvals process for feedstock procurement?
I think that having a pre-approved list of feedstocks for every state would be really complicated and really complex, not only to come up with, but to implement and to regulate on an ongoing basis. I think that would be extremely difficult and time-consuming. And I think that as we spoke about before, as long as you're saying waste-derived feedstocks, forest-derived feedstocks, and maybe a few energy crops, like such as the willow tree, shrub willow, or the things like that. I think that covers what the industry is using. So I wouldn't want to see, I know that the EPA obviously and the Clean Power Plan has got a lot to consider, has got a lot to oversee, and to me, having a pre-approved list of feedstocks is, come up with that, I think that would be really tough to do, and also it's not needed. I think you can just keep it simple and say waste derived, and that would cover it.
That's a great perspective. Peter follows up with a question: does the biopower industry have a position on carbon taxes?
No, we don't have a developed position that you'd see on a website or anything. I think that we've supported the Clean Power Plan. We support the we support the markets that the Clean Power Plan is set up for ERCs and mass-based allowances. That's not a carbon tax, but it's similar. I don't know. I mean, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that if carbon taxes are set up the right way and recognize the additional benefits of an industry like biomass, supporting economies and using residues, helping to support the health of forests, I think that's something that we would consider supporting.
To circle us back around to the question of pellets, which you brought up a couple of times. It seems like the UK and Europe happily use pellets, our pellets in some cases, for renewable energy. Why is the landscape so different here in the US?
Well, so the way that I look at it is that Europe is way ahead of the United States when it comes to developing clean energy policy, and they started doing it. They started putting into place these ambitious carbon reduction goals long before we did. And at that time, wind and solar weren't really, weren't really widely used, and the technologies weren't where they are today. So they started. I mean, I think that's. I think they have a very different political situation over there. They have more governmental support for clean energy, and they're ahead of us in that way. And they kind of started when bioenergy was just really one of the easiest technologies for them to implement. I mean, also if you're talking about the UK, obviously solar power is going to have, its own challenges there. But I do think that they have the kind of assistance that we don't have, and they have a head start in us.
So you would see that maybe as a future model for what we might see in the US.
Maybe. I mean, I don't, looking at our current political climate, it's kind of hard to envision a day when, that it's expensive to make pellets and use them and transport them. So, maybe there's some sort of investment. Maybe I'm totally speculating here. Maybe utilities would invest in that sort of, and the use of it's a possibility, but I don't see that happening anytime soon, and probably not to the scale that we see in Europe.
Yeah. Let's pick up on co-firing. So you mentioned there was maybe still some lack of clarity there. It does seem like a low-hanging fruit for states with strong biomass resources and strong coal generation portfolios. What do you see as a likely kind of mix of dedicated biopower versus co-firing versus maybe even CHP, which really appears more like as a footnote in the final rule rather than its own category in the CPP rules? What do you see as a likely shakeout in terms of use of each of those different ways to approach biopower?
That's a really good question. And, again, it's really going to be very different from state to state depending on the resources that are available, like you just mentioned. I tend to think that the Clean Power Plan is going to help, ensure that the current biomass fleet is strong and contributing. So I think that you're going to continue to see the kind of model in ag and forest waste. But I think that the wild card is really co-firing. I don't, like I mentioned before, I don't know if I said this clearly enough, but I don't really see government subsidies going to using pellets for energy. But I think that we might see happen is utilities looking to, if you're a utility with coal assets and you need to cut down on your emissions, and biomass is not a quote-unquote affected source of power, then why not invest in pellets? I don't know. I do think that that's a possibility that that we haven't, that is totally unknown. And then CHP you mentioned too. Topic. Biomass facility totally supports CHP. The issue with it in a lot of cases is that you need a very specific fit. If you're if you have an older facility, which most of them are, in the came online not very recently, then it's hard to kind of retroactively locate a facility that could be a steam host. It can't be something like a hospital with a lot of traffic that needs a quiet atmosphere. It needs to be a big facility that is close, that you can pump heat and steam into. And I think I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. But I do think that's something that we'll probably see more of. There will probably be more investment in that, and I think that we'll probably see some experimenting with co-firing pretty soon. But But again, there's so many variables, especially with the Clean Power Plan on hold right now.
Yeah, you hit right on what I was going to follow up with something like CHP, where it's such a very specific scale that happens on, but where it happens at that very specific scale, it can be very biomass incorporation into the Clean Power Plan might be able to, we might follow up on that on this finer scale when it comes to things that require a little more special attention than, these sort of broad scale regulations. You also brought up, the role of older facilities. So facilities older than 2013, do you expect any possibility of special consideration there? Is that something that states can still ask for as they submit their implementation plans for September?
Well, Marcus Kaufman sort of alluded to that when he was testifying in the Biomass Workshop. I don't see the EPA budging on the January 1st, 2013 cutoff. What I do see happening more is the state, acknowledge in its implementation plan, acknowledging the role that the biomass facility plays and kind of protecting it, if that makes sense. It's so you have your negatives, you have the affected EGUs that have to reduce their carbon output, and then you have the positives, you have the qualified facilities that came online, after January 1st, 2013, and I think that older facilities, older biomass facilities, are going to be sort of a neutral, reliable way to kind of close the gap. So I think that states are going to really value these facilities, but I don't know that they'll be able to, and I think the facilities will benefit from that. But I don't know that they'll be able to actually contribute to the markup.
All right, thanks. We're coming up on the end of our time here, so if any of our participants have last-minute questions for Carrie, go ahead and type them in now. Carrie, I've got one more for you before I'm going to ask you to wrap up with some final thoughts, but your expertise in public relations and outreach is extraordinary, so I want to hear your thoughts on this specifically. Biomass energy, we all deal with it, tends to have a public relations problem. So we know, and you've mentioned several times, so far in this conversation, that whole tree chipping for biopower is an unlikely scenario and so forth. But there still seems to be a perception gap in Clean Power Plan implementation. Is public opinion more or less impactful than insider stakeholder demographics around the state level air regulators tasked with building these plans? How do you see these perception problems creeping into this policy and its implementation?
That's a really, really good question. And I think it goes back to the slide that I showed you that had sort of the EPA in the middle of the industry and the environmental NGOs. I think that, the EPA is in kind of a tough position. And I think the way that you see these misconceptions of the industry playing out is really, it's just in the slowness with which the EPA, is kind of taking its time and developing a policy on biomass, and I think, or regulation on biomass, and I think that, I think that the environmental NGOs and the kind of anti-biomass groups, all they have to say is, let's protect the trees. And that's really sort of a sentiment that a lot of Americans will totally identify with. Of course we want to protect the trees, but it doesn't take into account the fact that, we still use wood for homes and we still use paper, and those, of course, all come from trees, and so does energy, biomass energy. So I think that, they have this sort of emotional kind of like message, and we have to explain what we're doing, which is, puts us kind of at a slight disadvantage. But I do think that we're educating. We're doing it on the local level with things like Bioenergy Day, which I very much appreciate all of you who have participated in that. It's just reminding people that this is how the forest economy works, and This is how biomass works, and it's to some extent we have to be patient about it. But I think that the way that we see that kind of playing out is the EPA has to be really cautious about what they do, and
yeah, some great thoughts.
I hope that answers
good
that
advice
question.
for any industry, to meet people where they are with your information. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Members. So I guess at this point, Carrie, I was going to ask you if you want to wrap up in any specific way, if there's a take-home, central take-home message you want to leave us with. What are your final thoughts today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is, I hope that that you've appreciated the discussion today, and I hope that that we can continue to work together. We just talked about Bioenergy Day. I hope that we can continue to work together on that. If anyone on the call has not participated in Bioenergy Day or doesn't know about it, please contact me, and I'd love to get you involved in that and supporting bioenergy.
So much. And thanks everyone for joining us today.